that at some point I was in fact attacked by a bear, and I had my very own field study and being in the midst of the fight or flight response, and I can assure you it was very helpful at that point. But it doesn't help me to manage my, these reactions don't help me to manage my stress when I'm on the concert stage. Because these haven't evolved to reflect the kinds of stressors that we're facing on a daily basis, these sets of reactions are kind of like, they're very old, not particularly evolved, and it's as if modern humans are running on a partially outmoded 100,000-year-old plus operating system. Something very important. So the primitive, hardwired, and involuntary response that you see on the screen, there's no thought goes into this. When the initial responses are mobilized, we're not initially thinking about it, about the stress itself. The next part is that we go into a survival mode. We're not in a mode where we're going to be able to thrive, but we go into a kind of survival mode where we're doing, our body and our mental processes are doing what is needed in order to help us to survive. The types of stressors for which the stress response evolved include a wide variety of life-threatening scenarios, as I mentioned. While these threats may have been life-threatening in origin in many, many thousands of years ago, other threats, such as threats to our ego, competitive threats, such as those in an audition, other kinds of fears of speaking in public, performing, which are tied to our ego, are also triggers for this fight or flight set of responses. So let's talk about the kinds of stress responses that ensue when we face threats that are related to kinds of musical performances. Now, can we move to the next slide, please? So we have a stress, and this stress could be an actual basic threat stress, that is, your life is being threatened, an imminent life-threatening danger. We could also have a real or imagined threat, an unknown situation or adverse conditions. Auditions, recitals, and important performances can all lead into creating the kinds of effects that affect our ability to perform when we're in a very important kind of situation. And I'm going to pass this over to Don now so he can begin to open up the discussion so that you can start thinking about the kinds of effects that stress may have on you during performance. Don?
Well, thanks. Excuse me. Thanks, Bill, and hello to everyone. Thanks for joining in. If we go to the next slide, we see that the effects are physical, mental, or attentional, and emotional. There are three different types of reactions to the stress. And part of the problem with them is that they all occur at the same time. And when we're trying to focus on something like playing a recital, in the midst of all this, it's hard to sort it out. So now that you can look at this in terms of three different effects in three different areas, I would ask you to consider for a second, what are your responses? What are your normal reactions? Excuse me. And take a moment to figure out what would go in these categories. The way I'd ask you to do that is think back to a highly stressful experience you've had recently. Hopefully, for this exercise, one that didn't go well, where you didn't respond well to the stress. And think about what it felt like physically in your body, mentally in your head, or in terms of your attention or focus, and also in terms of your emotions, especially fear, because fear is at the core of the stress response. So if you would, just take a second to think to a highly stressful circumstance, performance circumstance, in the last few months that didn't go well because of stress. And just imagine filling in the blanks in those three separate areas. Okay, Steve, could we have the next slide, please? Okay, so some of the physical effects of stress, these are just some because there's just a myriad of reactions physically, mentally, and emotionally. But in terms of The physical effects, the adrenaline racing through your body, surging through, which causes changes in heart rate, probably for most people picking up, and breathing both more rapidly and more shallow in the chest. The eyes start scanning, rapidly scanning as part of fight response, looking for danger in the outer world. So the eyes tend to scan. Because of the extra energy, people tend to perspire to get rid of the extra body fluid, go in the bathroom a lot. Butterflies in the stomach, which is not in the head, they're in the stomach. That's the acid being released into the stomach to get rid of the food that's in the stomach so you can fight better or run faster. And increases in energy flow to the muscles, preparing them to run faster or fight better, but that in a non-dangerous situation, like a recital, often causes unnecessary muscle tension, which causes more problems. Bill, anything you want to add to those?
Yeah, there's something, I think when we're talking about, let's go from the bottom of the column upwards. Muscle tension, as you're thinking about how muscle tension, what may happen when you're under stress and which muscles get tensed, what you'll probably notice very clearly and very soon as you start to analyze is that the muscle groups that get tense are very often mission specific. As a trumpet player, I would notice that the muscles in my diaphragmatic region or the muscles in my shoulders tend to get very tense, whereas a string player may find that either their bow arm, the wrist of their bow arm, or their left hand may get very tense. So it's something that as you begin to actively reflect on where muscle tension is manifested while you're under stress. Notice the specific areas and or groups of muscles. And jumping up a couple of places to the eyes rapidly scanning, I noticed immediately when I started working with Don that one of the first things I was doing was when I was trying to do something or trying to play for him and I hadn't yet centered and learned how to get focused, my eyes were going all over the place as if I was searching, trying to find the answer to what I needed to do up into the corner of the room. Well, that was just an involuntary kind of response that goes along with this fight or flight response, this primitive, involuntary sort of set of responses that are triggered when we're nervous or under stress. Anything else you'd like to add to this, Don, or shall we?
Certainly. I think you've identified the two key ones out of this list.
Yes.
Because some of these, although they occur, need not have an effect on your performance.
Yes.
Like, okay, the energy is going to be pumping. That need not affect your bowing. You're going to be perspiring. That need not affect your embouchure. Breathing you can control and hope you can control so it's deeper, and that's part of centering. The butterflies in the stomach is just an irritation in the stomach, and they need not affect you or your playing in any way unless you pay attention to what's called task-irrelevant cues. The uneasy feeling in your stomach is just an uneasy feeling in your stomach unless you choose to pay attention to it. Then you're going to distract yourself with something that's task-irrelevant, has nothing to do with the sound of the music. But as Bill really identified correctly, the muscle tension, that's number one. And what he described is very important for you to focus on, namely the specific muscles where you tend to tighten when you're under pressure. And I call those key muscles because those are very task relevant. It's very important for you to get them functionally relaxed in any circumstance, especially under high pressure situations. And the thing is, under high pressure situations, those muscles that tend to tighten the quickest and stay tight unless you bring conscious awareness to them. And the first thing you can do is right now identify what those key muscles are for you. We tend to tighten up under pressure. Generally, they're probably the areas where your teachers have told you historically or over the years, loosen your embouchure, loosen your shoulders or your neck or your shoulder tension or whatever it is, and go to that first and make sure that that's relaxed or functionally relaxed before you play. And the second, like Bill said, is watch where your eyes are focused, because more than 70% of our brains are tied to visual processing. It's, like Bill said, part of our hard wiring back to the caveman days. What your eyes look at, you need to process. You will process. You can't help but process in your mind. If your eyes scan, you're subjecting your brain to process a lot of irrelevant information because, again, you're not in a caged area with an animal after you. You're in a concert situation, a safe situation, and you need to control where your eyes go. Because if you let your eyes randomly scan, you'll both overload your brain with unnecessary information and distract yourself away either from the music or the note or the conductor's baton or nothing visual at all, because you can play probably most of your music with your eyes closed. At any rate, whether they're closed or open, what you need to do is make sure they never go up, because not only is the scanning bad, but when your eyes go up, you tend to go into left brain. And that's the last place where a musician needs to be before or during playing, is left brain, which is the analytical, critical, nerd side of the brain. And the right side is the musical, imaginative, sound-oriented part of the brain. And that's where you want to be before and during your play. And if your eyes go up to the left or just go up in general, you're subjecting yourself to go into left brain. If they scan, you're subjecting yourself to scan either in left or right brain and process the information. So the two I'd love for you to concentrate on in this list is the muscle tension in your key muscles and your eyes and controlling your movements.
And thanks, Don. And before we move on, would you like to talk maybe just a minute or so about what they can specifically do to begin to mitigate notice and then mitigate muscle tension even from tonight forward?
Well, certainly, that is before performing or even practicing or warming up, is that they do some slow, deep breathing and pay conscious attention to both checking out their key muscles for tension, and if they find any, simply to breathe it out. It's part of the centering process, which we'll talk about later. But the key is that you can either breathe consciously or unconsciously. Under pressure, certainly under fight-flight, people tend to breathe unconsciously in the wrong ways. Some hyperventilate too fast, too quick. Some breathe shallowly, which doesn't give them enough oxygen into their brain, which leads to the next area we'll talk about is attentional and mental problems caused by stress. But shallow breathing, not getting enough oxygen to the brain, creates mental issues that we'll talk about next, unless you have anything else.
No, that's great. Thanks, Don. We can talk about some of these later. Thanks.
Okay, so we have the stress response in terms of mental and attentional effects. The increased left brain thinking. This is thinking in words and numbers. This is critical thinking. This is do this, don't do that, don't screw up, why didn't I practice that more? Just rapid left brain thinking that's unnecessary for music. It's maybe helpful in a chess game or to solve a math problem or Scrabble contest, but this is music. This is creative. This is imaginative. You need to hear the sound, feel the tempo, feel your embouchure, feel the strings, and the left brain, that's all right brain phenomenon. That's all right brain functioning. The left brain processing words and numbers takes you out of the right brain. If you're crunching the numbers, you can't hear the music. If you're giving yourself a lesson in terms of a paragraph of instructions, you can't feel the tempo correctly. All the extra left brain thinking, the committee meeting in one's left brain under pressure causes inattention. It's hard to concentrate with that many voices going on in your head. And under pressure, people tend to get in beta thinking where it's not just one voice, it's a whole group of people screaming in your ear as you're trying to play a concerto. That causes lack of focus and attention. And obviously loss of concentration. It's hard to concentrate, again, without good oxygen to your brain, which makes people temporarily stupid, and it takes their concentration away. You can't concentrate without good oxygen to your brain and without good energy flow and without being in right brain. Concentration is a quiet alpha state, a quiet mind state of less thinking and more mental quiet, less thinking in words, and more just hearing the music or feeling embouchure in a state of focused awareness without words. That's focus. The left brain also contains worries or doubts or fears of screwing up, or like Bill said, ego loss. And the ego is very active under pressure because the ego is afraid of looking foolish or being embarrassed, and that just causes more problems. And if it's not done correctly, the ego is the first one to criticize you and how you just screwed up, what it told you should have practiced more, but you didn't. And the tendency to get very negative and imagine the worst. Just, if anything goes wrong, immediately goes right to the worst that could possibly happen, namely by the end of the concert, they're just going to take you out and shoot you. Bill?
This is really, really important, and I think also one of the keys of tonight's talk is about beginning to provide everybody involved in this webinar with a sense of awareness of what does happen. If you're recognizing these symptoms as being things that occur or happen to you when you're under stress or when things may not be going the way you want, you're not alone at all. I can tell you 100%, almost 100% of people involved in performing have a variety or some combination of these sorts of symptoms, the physical, mental, and attentional, and then later when Don discusses the emotional. So it's important to know what it is. The negative voices can come in very, very quickly, and if you don't understand that they are coming in, you don't identify them, and you have set up a kind of a mechanism to cope with them, they can really overtake everything that you're doing. So I think we can address this a little bit later within some follow-up questions, but these are all really, really key areas. So
and Bill, I think the key point that you're mentioning is this doesn't just happen to a few people. As long as they're human beings, it has nothing to do with musicians. This is, like you say, this is hardwired. This goes back eons, and we're all basically hardwired the same. And this is what happens to human beings under extreme pressure.
Yes, exactly. And what's extreme pressure for some people, if it's somebody who's working in a corporation giving a very important speech, it could be the same thing when we're sitting and playing an audition, hoping to win that particular job that we really have been working.
Listen, I'm not a trained musician, but with my military background, I've had loaded weapons pointed at me in close range seriously several times. And I can tell you that there's no difference to what I felt in that life and death situation or about to jump out of an airplane because I was a parrot and standing in front of a group of 10 people trying to give a public presentation. And it freaked me out more to give a short presentation about something I knew. I would gladly have jumped out of an airplane than give a short presentation because it was an overwhelming response that I was less in control of. It was much easier just to jump out of a plane than it was to try to speak. And that's why I have such great respect for musicians, because speaking is very easy compared to playing a classical instrument or singing classical music. It's much tougher. And these things happen to all performers.
It's absolutely true, and it's regardless of their level, regardless of where they are.
It doesn't matter, as long as they're human beings. I've sat with some of the best musicians in the world in confidence, in private, and also police SWAT officers and Green Berets. And again, these were all human beings who, in confidence, expressed all of this stuff, every piece of it. Okay, if we can go, Steve. And lastly, the emotional effects, and fear is at the bottom of it. Fear, worry is nothing but fear expressed in terms of words. The feeling of being out of control, of being out of control over this situation, we're powerless to do anything about it. Our insecurities come out. It doesn't take much for, like they'll say, for us to get negative, and we quickly get discouraged. and because the pressure continues to go on, and especially if we've made a mistake, then the pressure is increasing, it's not decreasing. The mistake just causes more pressure to the point of being overwhelmed, and part of being overwhelmed is these feelings of being out of control, but also the feeling of overwhelmed by all the left brain noise and instructions and worries and criticisms and doomsday comments that happen under pressure. Excuse me. Because under pressure, nobody performs perfectly. Mistakes, accidents are somewhat inevitable. It's not preventing them at all costs. It's because they're part of the territory. It's dealing with them and correcting them without too much fuss or delay and getting the train back on the track. Because if you go in there thinking you're going to be performing perfectly, you're setting yourself for a severe problem, a real issue.
Could I jump in on that, Don? Because that's another critically important point of our discussion and of this body of work, is that this is not about, just to clarify, this is not about peak performance that is playing at your very, very, very best all of the time. This is about learning how to cope with and to harness the effects of stress in positive ways so that you can get to a place of 90% of your best playing in a very consistent manner. Getting rid of those kinds of peaks and troughs. If you look at your level of performances over time, it's like a waveform. Instead of having really deep troughs, you want to make those shallower, and then the crests, keep those the same. So as we're talking about this is not about aiming for some kind of impossible to achieve, in quotes, kind of perfection. But rather this is about playing consistently at a very high level, a very optimal level, not trying to be, it's not about being a hero every time you're playing. It's about playing well every time you go out there, regardless of the circumstances, regardless of the situation.
Bill, I think that's really well said, and I think this is a key point. To me, the range that wins auditions, does well in recitals and juries, is the optimal range that you're talking about, which is about 90%. But it's not the peak range, which is 97, 99, 100. That's trying perfection, and it's too risky. It's red line. It's too close to just going over the edge, and I don't recommend it. I don't recommend it for Olympic athletes, race car drivers, or cellists going into an audition. It's just taking too many chances. Bill said the definition of optimal is playing well regardless of the circumstances, namely the liveness of the hall, the instrument not being right, the humidity, the sound of the hall, the people making noise. It's not a perfect situation, and it doesn't demand a perfect response. If it's not ideal, which it's not going to be, you make the best of it, which is optimal, which is 90 to 96, 97. If you can do that, you will.
Great. Thank you, Don. Why don't we move?
Yeah, let's move to the next, please.
Let's move on and let's talk about the stress response during a performance, Don. I'll leave it to.
So we're talking about the stress of performance, which is normal and natural, causing physical, mental, attentional, and emotional outcomes or effects. It's important for you because not all of those are going to happen to everybody all the time. So it's important for you to look at that list and figure out which are the ones that you have the most difficulty with, because otherwise it can cause performance consequences. Namely, you're not going to sound as good as you do in a practice room. It's going to feel strange because the energy is surging through your body. If you're not used to it, it's going to feel different than it does in the practice room, because of the energy and shallow breathing and attentional overloads and left brain hyperthinking because of problems focusing. The doubt works cause a lot of confidence, which causes people to get more cautious and protect their ego so they don't get embarrassed. You get super aware of other people and thinking about what they're thinking of you, which causes more distractions. By this point, you're probably making mistakes, and now you're starting to worry about what happens after you're done, if they're going to fire you, you're not going to get kicked out of the audition. So just in the middle of this performance causes more stress and some bad notes. Now, more stress, more physical, mental, attentional effects, more emotional effects causes more stress, and you've got a downward spiral.
This is very common. I think if you could take a moment to reflect on your own performances that did not go the way you were hoping to go, you'll probably recognize a lot of truth in this. But the good news about this is that although the stress response is automatic and involuntary, can you go to the next slide, please, Steve? You have a choice. You can either work on you can make things either worse or you can make them better. Now there are different here's a category of responses to stress that will actually make things worse. Next slide, please.
Yeah, there's two choices you have, and it's important to recognize that you have a choice in all this. The non-recommended choice is that you can perceive the stress as a real danger, a real threat. It's somebody who's actually threatening you with losing your life or a limb, which is not going to happen. You can interpret the effects as abnormal or wrong, like you're the only one in the world that experiences this normal phenomenon, and there's something wrong with you. There's something wrong if you don't experience some of these things under consequential circumstances, like a recital or an audition. You can try to get relaxed or take beta blockers or massive amounts of vodka. You can allow the left brain to go into overdrive and have a whole committee meeting, instruct you, and get negative. And afterwards, you'll get distracted by more of your doubts and judgments in a negative way. You can follow the counsel of your fears and play it safe defensively and become a helpless victim of your fears and doubts. You can ignore the problem into your next high-pressure situation. In the meantime, work on your technical skills, which are probably far in advance of your mental performance skills.
In other words, over-practicing.
Exactly.
Yeah. Or, next slide, please.
Or you can make a choice to make it better, and that's all it takes is a choice. You can hopefully, after hearing this from Bill and I, perceive the stress for what it is, which is a normal instinctual response to a highly pressured situation. You can interpret the effects that what you're feeling, although uncomfortable or unwanted, that they're normal. They go with the territory. You can actually learn to use that adrenaline. The whole catch with mental training that people have a hard time hearing, because it's a paradigm shift, is that you can actually perform better under pressure than you can in relaxed circumstances like a practice room. It takes a while to learn that, but it doesn't take as long to learn a musical instrument. You can learn it for two. To actually learn to channel that energy into more powerful performance. Maybe not more comfortable. If you want comfort, back to the beta blockers and vodka. Won't help you playing, but you'll feel relaxed. But this is not about getting overly comfortable. This is about using the energy that's going to be there naturally in high-pressure situations and learn how to use it and channel it. And I'm going to ask a trumpet player to tell you about that for a second.
Channeling energy is one of the things I noticed many years ago in working with Don, and one of my tendencies still when I play is that there are certain areas that get very tight in my body. And as I began to learn how to center and how to focus my conscious awareness on the sound that I was going to make, that was one thing that helped me tremendously. But the other thing that helped me was actually learning understanding how to take this energy and to essentially concentrate it and then funnel it out through the instrument. Almost, there are many performances I've played over the years where it almost felt as if I was doing very little of anything to create a really, really beautiful sound. In harnessing the energy, I've also found for many years I've had to drop tension throughout my body and sort of image, using my kinesthetic imagery, that the sound, the energy is essentially being concentrated and going out through the trumpet in all kinds of dynamic levels, not just playing very loudly. What we're talking about here in this whole set of making it better, responses to stress, are very important things. But I wanted to talk about something else. The next slide we can move to, Steve. And it's about creating new habits. There's a real chasm between knowing to a certain level what it is that you need to do to change things. It's another thing implementing and actually having that within you, knowing what it takes and then implementing these new kinds of practices and processes. And I wanted to talk about a couple of new habits that, if you go away from here tonight with several things, these are some of the really important ones. So creating habits of awareness. Begin to develop an awareness of what happens to you when you are in when you are in a stressful situation. What are your physical, mental, attentional, and emotional stress manifestations? You also need to begin to think differently about things. Learn to notice when things aren't going well. Learn to notice in the practice room when you're not doing exactly what you want to be doing. And to discern, is this what I want to do or is it not, rather than to judge. And you also will need to move from being reactive to proactive. Don't be a victim of your stress responses. Learn what's working and what isn't, or what doesn't work, and move toward correcting unhelpful patterns of thoughts and behaviors. And all of this within a daily practice. Every day presents opportunities to practice your new skills in these areas. Before I sit down or walk into a practice room and begin playing in the morning, I spend about 30 seconds hearing and literally feeling what I'm going to sound like for the day. If I notice that I'm kind of tense, I'll actually check for muscle tension. Then I'll hear very clearly the sound that I want to produce before I play my first notes of the day. And before I even warm up, I want to make that clear. Because what you think about is what you generate over time. And the more you practice and the more you make these habits become the new normal, replacing the old habits, this is the way in which you'll begin to see an extraordinary change in your ability to play and to perform. But this practice, daily practice, I'm talking about in addressing these specific areas that are related to stress and the stress response. These are just as vital to me, if not more so, as practicing scales and long tones. Could we move to the next slide, please? In the path to improving your performance, some things that you can do is to learn about your stress response patterns and to begin to organize the things that you need to focus on. And as you start to work on creating habits and new practice habits that incorporate these. Don, would you like to talk a little bit about these?
Well, I think what you just said, Bill, is very important, that this becomes a thing you work on a daily basis as you would
Absolutely.
any other aspect of your performance. Just wait till right before you're getting ready for a big event and then work on the mental stuff. This is just as important to work on, particularly most musicians, because their technical skills are ahead of this stuff, and you make it a habit to spend a few minutes, and that's all it takes a day working on this. In terms of practical ways you can do it, I have several suggestions. They're all on my website, which is dongreen.com. And one of the first things you might consider is taking the performance skills inventory, which mental areas are your strengths and which areas you need to work on. After you identify this, it also comes with a workbook. It's 11 strategies, different strategies for improving in practical ways in the areas in which you're lacking, in the areas that you haven't developed yet. and it's designed to help you focus just on the areas where you need to improve, where you can make the most improvement. So I'd suggest that. Of my books, the one most oriented towards what we're talking about today is Performance Success, and that's one I would recommend. Attention, as Bill mentioned, I've alluded to, is a strategy to help people get from left brain to right brain to control and channel their energy. And at first, when you learn it, takes about a minute and a half, but there's 3 centering training videos. They go in sequence like 3 etude books. And the 3 will help you over time learn how to center and get focused in right brain, mental quiet, channeling the energy in less than 10 seconds. And it's a strategy that I highly recommend that musicians learn. Yeah, Bill, if you want to say that.
Yeah, no, I think that I can't stress enough the importance and the value in this work. Don has devoted many decades to research in these areas, and what he helped me as a client and then also collaborator of Don's initially as a client, as a musician I had a very good career, but I was trying to understand why I wasn't able to play as well as I expected to all of the time, or just about all of the time. I had some nights were great, some were not so great, and Don really helped me very quickly to efficiently uncover and address some of the critical issues that were keeping me from improving my performing abilities. And the PSI would be a great tool for you to begin to use from here forward. I think what we should probably do, Don, I thanks so much everybody for listening, and I'd like to maybe move into the question.
Love to, yeah.
Segment of the discussion, and thank you very much.
Great. Well, thank you both. It's a wonderful topic, and obviously really great information for folks. We do have a number of questions, and I want to remind people just quickly that you can submit a question through the webinar control panel by just writing a question into the question box, sending it in. And if you wouldn't mind, it may be helpful to Bill and Don if you include your profession, maybe your instrument, your student, or a professional. That would help them best answer that question for you. One question here that maybe Bill could start by addressing comes from Nancy, and Nancy says, how can we integrate your techniques into our daily music practice at home or in our practice studio so that the optimum sensations you teach are not so remote or foreign to us when we perform?
Mm-hmm. So, well, thank you for that question. There are a couple of parts to my answer, really, and I think assuming that somebody's going back and has begun to assess what is and what isn't working, and they've come up with a basic strategy and kind of a set of exercises, centering and maybe some other things, examining their self-talk or whatever they may have come up with through an evaluation using this material. The issue is to use this on a daily basis. Now, the practice room transition into the concert hall is a very big one, and from my perspective, one of the beauties of this work is that it helped me to, it's a very effective way of, you can learn in the practice room, but you can also begin to simulate some of the conditions of the performance hall in a practice room environment. There are many simple ways that you can do this. One of Don's first exercises he had me do was to run up and down some sets of stairs to get my heart racing, because I remember playing for him in his studio, and in one of my early consultations, and I was trying to he said, you've got to do this to mimic the physiological manifestations of being under stress. And sure enough, I tried to play a long line without centering, and I was centered, and I noticed instantaneously a big difference in both what I was thinking about when I was focusing on, and my muscle, sort of the relative lack of muscle tension that allowed me to play this line. All the while my heart was racing and I was short of breath. So you could, as you're practicing these things, you could be very creative. I know that in Don's, in a number of his books, he talks about possible ways of creating simulation training environments. That's a very big thing in the work that Don has done at the Neural Symphony that I have done, also in various locations. We also will bring together groups of people working on the same material. So there are a number of very creative ways that you can, once you've begun to learn this material and practice, you can begin to integrate it on a daily basis by yourself, and then also creating simulation, creating simulation environments so that it isn't a shock when you're on the concert hall stage for the first time, but rather you've started to practice the transition. Don, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, I think everything you said I totally agree with, but especially what you said before, that even before you play your first warm-up note, you're doing a short mental rehearsal to get the sound right in your head so it comes out well, not something that need to correct. And something basically I ask people to do is put a sign up in their practice room, say, imagine it first, or imagine it before you try to play it, and get it clear in your head. And if you can't get it clear in your head without an instrument, the way you want it to sound at the right pitch and tempo, you're going to prove yourself to not be able to play it when you put the instrument up to your face or wherever. Get it right in your head. If that's a new thing for you, take a few extra minutes or learn how to do mental rehearsal, which is one of the 11 strategies, yes, so you can always get up to good starts on the day or in a rehearsal or in a practice by hearing it the way you want it to sound before you subject it to the instrument and the temperature and humidity and everything else.
That's absolutely right. And Don, if I wanted to mention this, and if you want to go into a little bit more detail, the idea between what we imagine, if we can imagine something very clearly, when we image something very clearly in our minds, and also bringing in our kinesthetic imagination as well, it's almost as if it's done. In my case, at this point, it's almost as if it's done before I do it. That's
exactly.
Say, I won't play musically and in a very special way. Maybe at the spur of the moment I do something slightly different, but it's a done deal before I've even played the note because I've heard it and I've imaged it so clearly.
And another word for done deal is no doubt.
Yes.
Which is key, that you start as a done deal, not worrying whether it's going to come out right or doubting that it will. It's a done deal. You just play it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
Great.
Steve, how about the next question?
Sure. We have another question here. And actually, in fact, when you talk about physical responses and asking people to think about their own, I know we have at least one person here, Marlena, writing in saying that she experiences such as cold hands, anxious, affecting her breathing, and she says she's a cellist and finds that her neck and shoulders tend to tighten, and she says, how do you relax them? And so maybe I think you both talked about muscle tension, maybe you...
Well, one of the things Bill was talking about is the simulation training of subjecting yourself to situations or getting your heart rate up and seeing where the tension is, and then doing the breathing and working it out while your heart is pounding from going up some flights of stairs. Another thing would be Alexander technique, which I'm a real big fan of, is make sure that your body's in the correct position. With the cold hands, that's one of the effects of stress because the energy flow of the body and circulation has changed. And one of the things you can do is, again, get used to getting your heart rate up and see if that does increase the flow of blood to your hands. You can also move your hands centrifugally to force blood flow out to the hands. And the last and least preferred way is to get used to playing with cold hands by putting your hands in ice water, believe it or not, in a practice room and getting used to figuring out how you can play with cold hands. That's not very popular, but it's very effective.
Thanks, Don. And if I could add one more thing in, talking about specific areas of muscle tension, and I think Don said this, but I just wanted to reiterate, a great way to mitigate some of this tension. I don't mean turning you from somebody who's tense into an overcooked piece of spaghetti relaxed, but just to drop out enough of the tension so that you feel relatively relaxed would be breathe in, tighten up one of those sets of muscles, whether they're in it could be in your neck, your shoulders, wherever it might be, and then exhale and drop that tension out. And repeat it a couple of times throughout the body until you feel relatively relaxed. Now, you're repeating it in the key muscle areas that you notice tense. If you're a cellist and it's in your bow arm, breathe in, tighten up those muscles that you notice are getting tense when you're nervous, and then exhale, drop it out. Move on to the next area, and so on. And that will help significantly initially.
Exactly. That's a great idea.
Great. Another question here. Two people have been in asking about shaking, and if you have any ideas or thoughts about, this is something I think a lot of people deal with as well, their hands shaking or maybe a leg shaking, and they're trying to perform.
Don, I'll let you lead with that one, Don.
Okay, well, again, this is part of the energy flow, and this is getting used to the high adrenaline, which is part of getting used to being a really good performer because the high energy goes with it. So again, we have the principle of overcompensation. One thing you can do is try to deny it, ignore it, and hope it goes away, in which case when the performance comes, it will increase. And there's a thing called purpose tremor. That the more you focus on an area shaking, it becomes more pronounced. It tends to have more tremor. So again, this is task irrelevant. I'm not saying totally task irrelevant, but if you make too much of a big thing out of it, it will increase and take your attention away from the music. So again, I would increase the energy level, crank it way up, try to make it tremble or shake, and play through it. And after you do it several times, it will distract you less and be less an issue, and that's how you work through this issue as far as I'm concerned. Bill?
No, Don, I think that's really great. I think the summing up of making it shake more, I think one of the things that, quite frankly, I hadn't thought about and I hadn't worked with somebody on. No, that's a very illuminating one, though. But I know that many people have talked over the years about the more they pay attention to these things, it just seems to get worse and not better.
Yes.
Yeah.
Make it your friend.
Yeah.
Great. Another question that has come in, this one from Allie. She says, when I try to visualize and hear internally what I want to sound like, often what I know I sound like from experience is what I end up hearing inside my head. And she says, how do I replace that?
Yeah, that's a great question, Emily.
That's a great question.
What we're talking about is mental rehearsal. I don't like the term visualization with musicians because it's not a visual thing. It's not figure skating or gymnastics. It's about the sound. So I like the term mentally rehearse is that the critical thing is the sound. The next critical thing is the proprioceptive feeling, the feeling in your fingers or your embouchure or your throat is the next. After the sound is the feeling. The third is visual because it's not a visual thing. And again, you can play with your eyes closed. So you haven't spent much time visualizing. Hopefully you spent more time listening to the sound. But I found that a lot of musicians aren't taught the skill of mental rehearsal. And it's a skill just learn how to, like playing scales. And if you just close your eyes and expect yourself to play through the ring cycle without any mistakes, you set yourself up for a mistake if you haven't trained it. So again, one of the 11 strategies that I'm suggesting that comes with the performance skills inventory is just about mental rehearsal for musicians. And if you don't know how to do it, I suggest you learn it from there. There's all sorts of books on mental rehearsal, but learn how to do that skill and then practice it, like Bill said, every day.
In mental rehearsal, I think one way for Ali to maybe begin this, if she can go back to a really great performance that she has had in the not-too-distant past and use that as her cue for sound and also for feeling. Something else that I think that I know works, and I know works for me as well when I'm practicing. I'm not just focused on my sound so much as I'm imagining the sound of another great player whose sound I've always admired, and I'm hearing it and hearing it and hearing it over and over in a very short passage of music. And then I imagine also what it feels like to play with that kind of sound. In case of a trumpet, the kind of energy behind the air, the kind of articulation. It's so essentially you're, in addition to training yourself how to hear and image what you're doing before you do it, and make it the actual product as closer to your imagination. You can also do what you do if you're learning jazz, or when I was a younger player, I was listening to lots of players and emulating their sounds initially. So, Ali, an idea I would suggest, in addition to finding that great sound and feeling of a recent concert that you had played very well, is to listen very, very intently to a recording of a particular musician who's playing you really love on your instrument, and hear that, and then bring that into your playing through your active imagination and through your active imaging. That's how that's how people learn to improvise. That's how people learn to develop their own voices. That's how artists learn. They learn by imitating it first, and then they appropriate enough and it becomes their own.
Wonderful. Well, we're getting very close to our 9 o'clock hour, so I want to begin to wrap things up here by thanking Bill Williams and Don Green for a really wonderful webinar here. Thank you for sharing your time and your expertise with us, and just again to remind people of the resources on the page right now, Don's website and all the resources he has available there. Thanks so much for everything.
I appreciate everybody listening in and sending questions, and the offer I'd like to make to everybody is that for the next 2 weeks they can get half off on all the materials on my website.
That's great.
If they use the code word Polyphonic 16, Polyphonic and the number 16, they get 50% off of everything, all the materials for the next 2 weeks.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Don. Certainly appreciate it.
Thank you both. It was wonderful.
Perfect.
Yeah,
thank you.
Thanks everyone for attending, and Bill, certainly whatever you guys want to leave us with tonight.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that the first steps forward in learning how to improve your performance are really, really simple ones. And this is a practice that I've embraced over the last 15 years, and it's helped me to enjoy my life as a musician, and also to help me to be able to express myself much more effectively as a performer, and to really give back to the things that mean a great deal to me in music, which is expression, music making, and I went into this for the love of music making. When I was in high school, I remember having a couple of extraordinary youth orchestra concerts and thinking I couldn't imagine devoting myself to something more meaningful than this. And along the way, through auditions and stresses and professional stresses, I kind of lost that to a degree, and this work helped me to get back to that place, and I can do it in a consistent way every day, essentially. So I owe a great deal to Don and to his research, and also the pioneering work he's done with musicians. So I'd encourage all of you to pursue this, and you'll be amazed at what you are able to build out of this work.
Thank you, Bill, and thank you, Stephen. Thanks for everybody for tuning in. All the best.
Yeah. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Don. Thanks, everyone, for joining, and we certainly hope you'll join us on our next webinar coming up in October, polyphonic.org, to check that out, and we look forward to seeing you soon.
Okay. Good night.